Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome. Welcome to the second event in the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies, Border Crossings and Asian Humanities. I'm Alex Xu. I'm Assistant Teaching Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies at the Liu Institute, as well as a Program Manager for the Ansari Institute in Global Engagement with Religion at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. Welcome to our talk. Today we have Alicia Turner of York University. I'm going to read a few words about Alicia that I printed out. Alicia Turner is Associate Professor of Humanities and Religious Studies at York University in Toronto, Canada. She is interested in the intersections of religion, colonialism, secularism, and nationalism in Southeast Asia, with a particular focus on Buddhism in Burma, Myanmar, over the past 150 years. Her book, Saving Buddhism, The Impermanence of Religion in Colonial Burma, explores the fluid nature of the concepts of sasana, identity, and religion through a study of Buddhist lay associations in colonial Burma. Her current projects include a biography of U Dhammaloka, an Irish sailor and agitator turned Buddhist monk, jointly written with Brian Bocking and Lawrence Cox, work on the history and concept of Buddhist secularisms in a genealogy of religious difference and tolerance in Burma. But she's also concerned with Buddhism and Asian cultures and theory and method in the study of religion more broadly, giving those of us who are concerned with contemporary Southeast Asia and religion and secularism in every other place around the world much to think with. Today you will hear about The Irish Buddhist, which was published in May 2020, whose subtitle is The Forgotten Monk Who Faced Down the British Empire. The subtitle of today's talk, however, is Transnational Buddhism in Opposition to Empire. Professor Turner.
Is that working? Oh, it is. Great. Thank you for that introduction. And I really want to thank you, Alex, and the Liu Institute for inviting me here. This is maybe, I really think, probably the ideal room to present this information in, or to present this book and this project that we've worked on for quite a while in the part that I'm really, really pleased that we both have folks really thinking critically about religion in Asia and folks who work on Buddhism, but also Irish studies in this room, and we have folks from Burma here represented and really interested in thinking about the intersection of those three. Really, honestly, I am in no way as charismatic or dynamic as Dhammaloka. He would be up here having an amazing time talking to all of you because you are his world and his audiences. The work I'm presenting and the book we published is actually a work of collaborative work between three scholars. Brian Bocking, who was the first chair of the Religious Studies Department at University College Cork, and Lawrence Cox, who is a sociologist and a scholar of social movements at University of Ireland at Maynooth. In addition to that, at the very beginning of our process, we had support from your very own Tom Tweed, who helped us find sources, but also was really an inspiration for helping us think about translocal religion and how you think about a figure who moves across boundaries. So, here we go. What I'm going to talk about today is mainly thinking about migration and boundary crossing in the early 20th century in Burma and Southeast Asia. Because with the three of us, my focus is really Burmese Buddhism and thinking about Southeast Asia. Lawrence and Brian brought many other skills to that. And so when we present on behalf of the three of us, it's a little odd to try to be presenting all of these, but I'll give you what I can. But while I'm going to mainly focus on early 20th century, the colonial period in Burma, I actually want to start with the present moment and start with contemporary Burma and the political situation of the present. And then I'll draw some connections back and forth in the ways in which I think our research into the past can help us understand some things in the present. So on February 1st of 2021, the military in Myanmar, led by General Min Aung Hlaing, deposed the democratically elected government of the National League for Democracy. The aftermath of this coup saw massive popular uprising across the country, the largest and most sustained really in a century, as well as brutal violence and open murder of civilians by the military that is ongoing. To say that these are dark times for Burma is an understatement that can't even touch the depths of loss that we've experienced. This coup came at the end of a decade of what has been known as the transition period in Burma, a transition from a military dictatorship that had stretched from 1962 to 2011, 2012-ish, to a democratic or more democratic system. The transition was a time of opening up, of hopeful anticipation for the future for the first time in more than 2 generations. And with the end of formal censorship and there was a flowering of civil society, economic progress, an opening up of the media, political parties, and really a generation of young people with new ambitions for the first time. And yet this time of transition, this decade, was also a time of deep conflicts, with the rise of a Buddhist nationalist movement and Buddhist nationalist sentiment that fomented violence against Muslims and justified the genocide against the Rohingya that was carried out by the military. In the first month of the protests, really saw unprecedented movements in the streets. The protests had a strikingly new ethos and a new aesthetic not seen in earlier protests in Burma. So while we'd had protests in 2007 called the Saffron Revolution, and which led by monks protesting against the military, and we had large movements around the Buddhist nationalist Mabata around 2015, in each of those, the dominant images on the streets were the Buddha and Buddhist monastic robes, Buddhist monks. But in 2021, the things we got were quite different. In the place of monks and images of the Buddha, we get memes, we get humor, satire, art. The prominent figures are poets, artists, young lay people instead of monks in these things. And while the symbol of the political party, the National League for Democracy, was prominent in the streets, just as common were the expressions of multiple specific identity groups. Images of Gen Z in jeans and t-shirts, drag queens and transgender people, people of every identity affiliation conceivable, representing multiple ethnicities, workers, farmers, neighborhoods, villages. You see this pluralism in the streets. In the urban areas in February of 2021, the protests really began to look like a pride parade, representing and celebrating diversity of identity groups. And in this outpouring, it seemed to be that the particularity and diversity of identity was what was being defended, that a return to military rule would threaten the well-being of groups to be who they are. In these protests in 2021, religion was clearly present. If Buddhism had been the dominant in the earlier protests, sort of images of Buddhist monks, but now here, the image of religion is explicitly interreligious solidarity. The dominant image is not the Buddha, but of Buddhist, Muslim, Catholic, and Hindu women walking hand in hand. Buddhist monks and nuns are present, for sure, but they're one voice in a religious cacophony demanding change. The image of a Catholic nun appealing directly to police and soldiers not to fire is deeply moving and widely circulated on social media. And the image became iconic, representing religious solidarity against military violence. And whereas the symbolism of earlier movements was explicitly national, right, the defense of Burma as a nation, this movement is explicitly transnational, with the 3-finger salute demonstrating affiliation across the Milk Tea Alliance, uniting Thailand, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Burma in a set of protests. While this outpouring of solidarity and support really came as a shock to the military, obviously, who thought they would just simply be taking over, it also came as a shock to a lot of international observers. But as a historian watching from afar, it not only made me very proud and I recognized the people I knew well in those streets, it evoked resonances with protest movements in Burma over the past century. And while I certainly don't want to equate the two moments or take anything away from both the bravery and the devastation of the presence by making connections between the two, I think the solidarity that transversed and defied the boundaries of religion, ethnicity, class, and nation is an ethos that I see earlier moments in Burmese history, and it's specifically one that the research on Dhammaloka taught me how to pay attention to, how to think about where it was. So I want to go back 110 years. In 1911, Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims marched and shut down the entire city of Rangoon together. They marched from Chinatown all the way through the Indian bazaars and Indian areas to the center of town with a golden Buddhist pagoda and a central square that was really a representation of colonialism to the courthouse. They did this in order to show their solidarity with an Irish Buddhist monk who'd been accused of sedition against the British colonial government. The ethnic and religious solidarities of that moment, to me, seem to echo in the present as I watch people march down exactly the same streets and assert a very similar pluralist and democratic vision of what it would mean to belong in Burma. And so I want to look at the history of some of those parallels and connections today. In 1911, U Dhammaloka, a working-class Irish sailor who had ordained as a Buddhist monk in 1900, was tried for sedition. It was tried for sedition in Moulmein. The appeal was then heard later in Rangoon. And he was tried for making statements that would cause enmity between Her Majesty's subjects. That's an interesting sedition law. Specifically, he had actually in his preaching claimed that the British came as a colonial power with a Bible in one hand and a bottle of gin and a Gatling gun in the other. And this was his analysis of colonialism. This is his statement that there are three aspects you need to be concerned of: the violence and the political violence of colonialism, the gun, the cultural change to the morals and ethos of the consumption of alcohol, opium, gambling, the bottle, but the Bible. And for him, Christian missionary activity was a threat to Buddhism, and as a threat to Buddhism, it was part of the colonial project and needed to be resisted. And his colonial response was really about Buddhist organizing in opposition to empire, in which those three things, Christian missionary activity, the British government, and cultural change, were all united. He'd developed this reputation as a really popular Buddhist preacher across colonial Burma, really across mainland Southeast Asia, a warning of the threats of British colonialism posed to religion. The trial for sedition in Moulmein attracted a very large group of supporters, but it's this appeal that was held in Rangoon that really demonstrate the breadth of communities that were pulled together. From the appeal case, we get this statement in the press: the Burmese stallkeepers, the Iron Bazaar in Lamada, that's Chinatown, the Surrey Bazaar, and the Strand. So all of these ethnic communities across the city came together and filled the square. So what happened? How did we get here? Who's this guy? And why do we get to the sort of moment? So the man who would become Dhammaloka was born outside of Dublin in Blackrock, the Booterstown area, we're told, near what was then the new port of Dunleary, about 1856. If we're right, if we're right for the person that we think we have. We can't be sure because he uses a lot of pseudonyms, probably because he's trying to get around the authorities. Sometimes he uses a pseudonym that'll mark him particularly as Protestant because he thinks that'll get him past this. Sometimes he'll use Catholic synonyms, but it's not completely sure. But we have a figure from the census records we feel pretty confident about. The other reason we can't know for sure exactly who he is because he like to take liberties in what I have come to think of as his autohagiographies. He starts to tell stories about himself that are really quite enjoyable. But if we have the right person, the house he was born in is literally in the shadow of the Catholic Church. And the Catholic influence of his early life is very represented later on, and really throughout his life. But also he's close to the movement and the cosmopolitanism of the sea and the sailors. The new port that's built there that becomes a really central port that is just down the road, I've done the walk from one to the other, is an important aspect of his formation and his background. Like many other Irish Catholic young men of that era, he saw very few prospects in staying in Ireland. So he hops a ship, becomes a sailor, and eventually ends up in the United States. For him, as millions of others, emigration was basically inevitable. Roughly 1 in 2 Irish people emigrated at the time, and produces the Irish diasporas that we know well here. By most of accounts of Dhammaloka's life before his Buddhist ordination in 1900 spans probably 4 decades in at least 3 continents. So the work researching him and understanding him involved understanding historical events and popular movements in Ireland, England, the United States, Japan, India, Australia, as well as all of Southeast Asia. And also thinking about and understanding social forces ranging from the development of railroads and steam shipping and intercontinental shipping routes to hobo culture in the US to poor white beachcombers in Asia. From what we know, he emigrated from Dublin to Liverpool, where he took a job on a ship, and he worked his passage from there to New York. So those are my images of what it might mean in that era. In the recounting of his life, or one of the recountings of his life that we trust the most, it stated that he beat his way on a freight train to Buffalo from New York. Soon tiring of a dishwashing job that he had in Buffalo, he boarded a side-door Pullman to Chicago. And after a few weeks in the Windy City, during which he was unable to find work and was obliged to beg for food, he continued westward. Side-door Pullman here means he jumped freight trains. And this is really our first introduction to Dhammaloka as a hobo, and thinking about what migrant worker hobo life would mean in the late 19th century, moving across the United States. And he continues to jump trains, but we can see Dhammaloka intersecting with a number of aspects of Irish migrant history in the US, including the so-called tramp army of impoverished men who are seeking a living from odd jobs, moving from place to place in this time. But also this group of men really gathered to trade information about where you might reasonably find good accommodation or food or a little bit of work, but also a lot of political information. We know during this time that the man who would be Dhammaloka likely got much of his education in radical working class and anti-imperial politics, probably from this group, this network of plebeian intellectualism, as we like to call it, where these traveling men would share books, newspapers, give informal lectures, would really have like the equivalent of a workers' university where they were gathering at any given time. Dhammaloka worked his way all the way to California. He worked briefly in inland shipping, on a fruit boat, and then in San Francisco, where he worked on the docks for quite a while, which again would have been a really interesting multicultural place in which labor was very much segregated in terms of ethnicity, but he would have had a substantial interaction with the Chinese community in the dock working in San Francisco. And we get some implications there that he had been thinking and critically about race at the time. He works on a boat from San Francisco back and forth to Japan and eventually ends up in Rangoon. Now, we know a lot of this story because Dhammaloka told it to another itinerant American in Asia who could corroborate it from his own experiences. So what we get is another migrant worker who is then comes and he says, yes, I know this is how you jump a train here. Yes, this is where I worked on a fruit boat. And this points to a really larger issue in that although Dhammaloka was in no doubt unique, and if you begin to hear how hilarious and bombastic he is unique. He comes from a much larger milieu that gets overlooked of poor and working class itinerant men in Asia in the late 19th century, and mostly European and American men who become known as beachcombers. And as we discovered, it wasn't uncommon for these men to convert to non-Christian religions and to deeply embed themselves in local cultures and politics, at least for a time. So in 1900, Dhammaloka was ordained as a fully ordained Buddhist monk in Rangoon, after having spent an unknown number of years living in that monastery as a novice. He claims to have been in Rangoon working as a tally clerk on the docks before 1885 and to have spent a lot of time as a novice. We really can't track those parts of the story down. But from the start, his monastic career really reflects and engages an ethnic plurality of colonial Rangoon. His ordination was overseen by a very important and orthodox Burmese Buddhist monk there, but his ordination sponsor, which is sort of key figure for a monk becoming ordained, was actually a Chinese man and the members of the Chinese Cycling Society. So you get this idea that his support is a little bit broader. Moreover, Dhammaloka's home is the Tavoy Monastery, Duwejiao, in the Theodore monastic complex, on the edge of what was at that moment one of the most important and bustling Chinatowns in all of Southeast Asia. And it was nearby to a number of Indian neighborhoods. Rangoon at this point is a port city, and this is the height of its moment as a hub of migration and immigration, and really intra-Asian networks. Dhammaloka's monastery was really at the heart of that migration itself. The Tavoy Monastery, in addition to being the school for local children, was also really known for taking in traveling lay people. And in fact, when I started doing research on the Tavoy Monastery, I was trying to find historical antecedents, and I found a Tavoy monastery, but trying to get directions there, I found out that there were like 4 or 5 Tavoy monasteries through Rangoon. And when I finally got there and started talking to the abbot, I said, seems like the stupid question, why are there so many Tavoy monasteries in Rangoon? And he gave you the answer that people often give academics, which is, you seem like an intelligent person. This is a really dumb question. And he answered, to house people from Tavoy. But in Burmese, there's a difference between saying people and monks. And he was not saying to house monks who come from the city of Tavoy. He was saying to house lay people. And as I look over, there's a couple of people's laundry right there, a couple of lay people's laundry, not monks' robes there. So the Tavoy monasteries, but really the one Dhammaloka is in particular, became known as a place that people could stay temporarily. So if you came in on a boat in Chinatown just down the road from there, you could come in and find a place to sleep, to stay, whether you came as a petty trader, you came for education, you came for a number of things. And while it was originally a place for people from the shipping port to the south of Tavoy, it eventually, or very soon, became a place for people from much farther afield. So one American beachcomber who shows up there depicts having arrived at the Tavoy Monastery only to find both an African and another Irish sailor who are already staying there that day. He's shocked to find them in this Buddhist monastery. Other stories recount our elite Burmese Buddhist, sort of snobby, coming down to a festival at the Tavoy Monastery and wanting to see what's there, and then just complaining that the place was, quote, full of Indians and Chinese. So it was a place of intersection and intermingling, even if it didn't really make our snobby Burmese nationalists very happy. And it was sort of known as this ethnic and religious meeting ground. This image, so I'm going to go give you a little more Dhammaloka. The image of an Irish Buddhist monk in 1900 was really the paradigm of the phrase or the concept of going native. Not only did Dhammaloka wear monastic robes, he was wearing Asian clothes in an era in which many middle-class Asians were donning European dress. He went barefoot, which the British considered a very subordinate racial marker of racial and religious status. He practices collecting alms and poverty. And this is really, this is a high crime against a Victorian ethos of work, hard work, sort of a Protestant ethos, begging, rejecting this sort of middle-class culture, rejecting European culture, was really marked him from the very first moment as in opposition to British and European culture, but also really in opposition to colonialism. And the ritual submission, often noted in these colonial accounts about his ordination ceremony, of a white man submitting himself to an Asian religious hierarchy. And he did. He was a junior member of a monastic hierarchy, which is very hierarchically structured. This was seen as a particular threat to white dominance and white superiority. And it wasn't just his status as white and Buddhist, it was his Irishness too that made the colonial officials really nervous. Much of the army in Ireland, or in India and Burma, really from the bottom to the top, from privates to officers, was Irish and mostly Catholic. And their loyalty to an imperial British Anglican elite was a source of anxiety. They were worried. And Dhammaloka appealed both to the sailors and to the soldiers in Rangoon quite a bit. So Dhammaloka's status alone, before he even opened his mouth to start speaking against empire, is a threat to the colonial project. Thinking about this milieu a little bit, after 1869, the opening of the Suez Canal and the arrival of new technologies, railroads, steamships, telegraphs, the sort of things we know, it not only expands the colonial interventions into Asian lives, it also creates insatiable demands for labor. So Sunil Amrit has documented massive migration of South Indian Tamils across the Bay of Bengal and to Sri Lanka, Ceylon, but to Burma, Singapore, Malaya, these sorts of places to provide plantation labor for these colonies. In addition, this is mirrored by a westward migration of Hokkien and Cantonese Chinese workers and traders who come there to the same areas of Southeast Asia. And internal migration within India and Burma, so a migration in Burma from the north to the countryside and the colonial port cities in the south. All of this is this moment of massive migration. But what's often missed in this story of Asian migration is a major movement of working class European and American men to British colonial Asia between 1850 and the 1870s. These are workers, sailors, soldiers, and really probably made up about more than half of the European population in India at the time. And they came to literally construct the technologies of empire: railways, telegraphs, steamships, and ports. The interracial and interreligious interactions were inescapable in the lives of this migrant poor and working class, especially in these port cities. Together, waves of labor migrants, Chinese, Indian, European, laborers, carpenters, petty traders, dock workers, particularly, and sailors, they literally constructed the port cities of Asia, produced its goods, and moved them around the world. They built not just the physical networks that undergirded empire, but the personal, social, intercultural networks that made all of this activity possible. So while the white status of European working class migrants brought them certain privileges in colonial hierarchies, those were always tenuous privileges. These poor whites had far greater interactions with Asian workers than the European elites that were sort of commanding their labor. And this ideological apparatus of empire, with its strict racial, colonial, ethnic, religious divisions, honestly was only ever a thin veneer over a much more pluralist and cosmopolitan set of interactions that are taking place at the height of British colonialism. Poor whites are much more integrated into this multi-ethnic operations of colonial workings and much less likely to respect racial boundaries in these practices of division. Colonialism in reality ran on interactions and interconnections. And thus Dhammaloka's story isn't just the story of an unusual European monk, but it really reveals a varied interactions among people of different ethnic, religious, and class backgrounds. And it really also belies the narratives of the colonial state and the later nationalist formulations that these boundaries are inherent, strict, and always perceived and enforced. Those identities that have become to be particularly strict and brittle in the colonial and post-colonial moments, we can see from this history themselves were always just a facade on top of much more pluralist interactions. And a lot of the story that gets told about the rise of nationalism, the rise of print capitalism, and these rising networks of middle-class elites who come to be in opposition to the colonial state, produce national identities, the sort of Benedict Anderson thinking about print capitalism, or the technological transformations that happen. But most of that dominant academic analysis has really been about elite or in middle class intellectual connection, and it's neglected this much broader interconnection that made it all possible. Dhammaloka's status as working class, former sailor, surrounded by other poor whites and Asian migrants of similar backgrounds, points us to a really different set of connections. I think one of the things that we forget when we start talking about intellectual cosmopolitanism, and the middle class, print capitalism, imagined community sorts of things, is that if the world was interconnected for colonial elites, it was only ever interconnected because there were people who did that physical connecting, right? Working class people actually did and connected it. And so I think Dhammaloka lets us see some of that in really useful ways. After his ordination in 1900, he quickly establishes himself as a public figure, defending Burmese people and Buddhism against the threats of colonialism. So his first moment of notoriety is in which he confronts an Indian police officer for wearing his shoes on the sacred grounds of the Shwedagon Pagoda. The pagodas are solid edifices with a long platform around them that you walk on and perform rituals on. But the reason they're sacred is because underneath of them, the Shwedagon holds actual relics of the Buddha. 8 hairs of the Buddha are there. And so to walk on that is particularly defiling. And while Burmese people would never, ever wear their shoes there, Europeans exempted themselves from this rule and said that they could walk all over with their shoes. So he confronts them and sort of creates this anti-colonial agitation in the defense of Buddhism. He goes on major preaching tours across the colonial province. He's met by crowds of thousands. He's a rock star. People love him. In these tours, he's both recognized as really belonging and also really outside of Burmese culture. He spent a long time in the monastery. It's clear he spent a long time as a novice. He's been ordained for quite a while. And he has this really thorough integration with the rituals and daily practices of monastic life. And that means he very clearly performs what it means to be a Burmese Buddhist monk correctly. He wears his robes correctly. He takes his bowls out. He goes barefoot. He can perform that very much correctly, and then is recognized, particularly by people in the countryside as he goes on these preaching events, in ways that later middle-class European Buddhist monks or men who become Buddhist monks later never really achieve that sort of clear performance. Even though he's absolutely beloved for this sort of belongingness and recognizing that he's there, and in fact, like he's a rock star, women would lay down their hair and he would press across them to his preaching events. But when he opens his mouth, things are a little different. Where Burmese monks of that era are really valued for being reserved, not having strong emotions that are put forward, preaching is beginning to open up into a more vernacular form in which you convey ideas instead of a really ritualized form. But at the same time, Dhammaloka doesn't fit that either. He comes in bombastic, he's loud, he is political and upfront from the very beginning. He always begins his preaching by saying that there were Burmese monks much, much better qualified to preach the Dharma to them, and he sort of saves that space for them, but that he had come to warn Burmese Buddhists of the treachery of missionary Christianity, the threats of European culture, drinking, gambling, and the political threats and insults of colonialism. And it's this juxtaposition between performing physically a very much a Burmese Buddhist monastic self and then speaking in terms of really confronting empire in explicit terms that really gives him his appeal and his unique status. Now, he doesn't limit his work to Burma. 1902, he has a major trip to Japan. It becomes part of Pan-Asian Buddhist organizing there. 1909, he has a major trip through Ceylon, Sri Lanka, with the support of Anagarika Dhammapala. And between 1903 and 1905, he establishes a series of Buddhist missions and schools in Singapore, Bangkok, and Penang, each offering free education for local boys in English and missions for the promotion of his brand of anti-colonial Buddhism. I want to touch a little bit on these last three missions because I think it again tells us something about the sets of interconnections and the ways in which he brought migrants together to cross across boundaries of class, nation, and religion. So in Bangkok, Dhammaloka established a school at Wat Ban Thawai. It was initially advertised as a free Buddhist English language school, but it soon came to be much more than that. So a sign on the school says in Siamese and English, Buddhist school, but this newspaper reports to a certain extent that's a misnomer. At the present, and it's only been around for 6 weeks, there are 60 pupils, Muslims, Eurasians of all creeds, and of course, Buddhists. And in fact, the newspapers are very, very surprised by the sort of mixing that happens there. The part of town that he's in has quite a few foreign embassies and Europeans, but actually is really known as a place of working class and Asian migrants from the region to that area. So the Bangkok Times explains a little while later that has found an exceedingly handy place for his school. It's in the center of a populous district with a large working class population, but it's built away from the sort of bigger streets. And it says there, the children of Malays, Siamese, Chinese, and Hindus are taught English in the 3 hours without a fee. It matters not whether the pupils were Muslim, Christian, or Latter-day Apostles. They were received in Wat Ban Thawai school. So you get an idea that all of the places in which he's working, we have this sort of intercultural ethos. In Singapore, he establishes a Buddhist school as well. And there he puts it in one of the poorest parts of Singapore and has really the children of factory workers who gather around him. But in Singapore, again, you can see from his patrons, he has one of his larger patrons is a Chinese family of opium merchants who had mostly been Taoists or supported Taoist temples before that. His other is a Japanese Mahayana Buddhist missionary, and then a Sinhalese gem trader. And then finally, a Chinese Presbyterian who is actually promoting a Neo-Confucian revival. You begin to see the number of different interactions that are going on in these places. And so he puts all of these things together. And finally, in Penang, he works out of a Burmese monastery and temple that's there. But in Penang, he's invited to lecture at the Chinese Town Hall and Chamber of Commerce and at the Penang Hindu Association. So again, the people recognize him as belonging to these multiple things, and that his Buddhist project, which is an anti-colonial project, is one that doesn't respective of those boundaries, or for whom those religious boundaries are not necessarily important. And again, where he works in Penang, he really built into this multi-ethnic, multi-religious solidarity. The place where he is in Penang is very close to the water, very close to sailors. As different as these three places, Penang, Singapore, well, four, Bangkok and Rangoon are, there's actually a similar feel to all of them. And there's a similar feel to that and to the parts of Dublin where he came from. They're all close to the water. They all have active shipping and sailors, and they all have these multi-ethnic and multicultural religious interactions. The Tavoy Monastery in Rangoon is located just up Godwin Street from what is probably the busiest public wharf in Rangoon at that time. Any non-mass, sort of non-elite traders, all small traders, would have come straight up that street. It's adjacent to Chinatown, and it's really known as welcoming people from all over. In Bangkok, his Wat Banthawai is in this multi-ethnic area near the river and commerce, these foreign embassies. In Penang, his base, this Burmese monastery, is a place that's central to the island's fishing community and its sailing and shipping community, but it was also the place with the only well in that part of the island. So it was a place where everybody came together. All of these places are connected in part by his background as being a sailor, and part of these kinds of interactions. And not only they share this sort of particular multi-ethnic and pluralist ethos, but they're directly connected through reference to the colonial port town of Tavoy. Tavoy is a small place, but actually a particularly multicultural place. So the name of the monastery in Bangkok was Wat Banthawai, but the Y is the Thai way of saying Tavoy, because it was founded by people from Tavoy, the Tavoy Monastery in Rangoon, obviously, and then the Burmese monastery that's in Penang has really strong connections to Tavoy. All of these are sets of shipping lanes and connections on the Bay of Bengal, the Andaman Sea. And it's this Tavoyan bond of migrant sailors who have loose connections but welcome people to be Tavoyan, to come to the Tavoy Monastery in all of these different places that really creates these sets of networks. In all of these places, the river, the sea, the boats, the sense of movement of people in transit are ever present. From the docks and the well-worn statue in Tavoy of an earth goddess who is the protector of seafarers. And its location across the hills from Bangkok, just across the sea from Rangoon, makes the Tavoy a place that really linked all of these migrant networks. So migrants of Indians, migrants of Chinese, overseas Chinese that are coming, as well as sailors, poor whites. And it's this sort of pluralist ethos and quiet connections and networks that never really raised to the level of attention of elite discourse. No historian sort of goes back and says, clearly this is how people were interconnected. But once you can begin to see that it was Tavoy that connects all these things Dhammaloka was able to do, you begin to see that it was the working class folks that made his work possible. Tavoy seems to epitomize the overlooked plebian cosmopolitanism of sailors, workers, petty traders who cross these boundaries and migrate throughout the period. And so this gets us back to, we'll take the boat back to Rangoon. The sort of multi-religious, multi-ethnic ethos played out when Dhammaloka was then confronted with sedition and charged, and then his appeal that happened in Rangoon. In response to his conviction for speaking against Christian missionaries and implicitly against the British colonialism, people of all backgrounds rallied to Dhammaloka's side and created a defense fund for him in Rangoon. Actually, the first motion picture, the first movie theater that's ever existed in Rangoon, took all of its takings for January and donated it to the defense fund. So you begin to see him sort of connected into these new networks. The multi-ethnic community of Chinatown around his monastery and the Indian communities come together. In his appeal was at the Chief Court before Justice Toomey, also Irish. It was initially scheduled for Friday the 13th, but they actually shut it down because there were so many protests that day. It happened at the Chief Courthouse, which was newly created overlooking Fick Square, and Fick Square, Mahabandula Panjanao, is really a center created to sort of celebrate empire in the center of the city, but directly across from the golden spire of the Sule Pagoda. But if this is downtown Rangoon, you sort of get a little picture of what the center of the colonial city looked like at that point to give you an idea. So the stallkeepers from the Iron Bazaar in Lamada, that's Chinatown, Suratipura Bazaar, the Strand Municipal Bazaar, all closed down, and they wind all the way up to Fick Square that is overfilling with people. To give you an idea for where that is, the monastery that is lit up there is Dhammaloka's Tavoy Monastery. It's on the edge of Chinatown, the Municipal Bazaar downtown, the Sura Bazaar in the Indian Quarter, all the way over to the Chief Court. So if you look at that huge chunk of the city being completely shut down in this event, in a city that was intentionally segregated on racial and ethnic lines. You have Chinatown, you have Indian sections, you have Hindu and Muslim sections, you have downtown, you have Burmese sections. The idea of sort of taking all of that and bringing it together and shutting down the town shows a kind of plurality that is what I really saw in common with what was happening in 2021. Dhammaloka had been greeted as a hero on his preaching tours in these small towns, but here in the city, it was really the sort of broader multi-ethnic coalition that came to celebrate and to defend him and sort of offer the friendship that he had given them. So how does this get us back to the present? I think to a lot of observers, looking at what happened in 2021 on the streets and the protests, the kind of radically pluralist solidarity that we saw in Rangoon in 2021 was unthinkable even a few months earlier, even in the election campaign that led up to this military coup. In the moment of the transition, public discourse and politics had really been focused on the amplification of divisions, in particular with the anti-Muslim